And thank you for the welcome that the Dean and the head of the department expressed to me as well. It's a pleasure to be here. In fact, I'm from central part of Canada, the prairie part of Canada, and when I arrived in Poland, I thought that I've come back home. Poland seems to be very similar to Saskatchewan and Manitoba, where I grew up, before I moved later to Toronto, where I teach, and continue to teach at the University of Toronto. And one of the influences that I had at the University of Toronto, of course, was Marshall Mcluhan, who's known to everyone. And I'm not going to particularly say a great deal about Marshall Mcluhan, but I thought I might say a word because he's certainly relevant to the central theme of this conference on culture, communication, and cognition. Because Marshall Mcluhan was one of the first to think that the medium of representation and communication actually affected the message that one was trying to express. So that it was a different thing to make a public lecture than to write an article or a book. And Mcluhan's theories about this were very broad in scale and were readily applied to other medium of communication, such as computers and television and so on. And some of you have read his books. I gather they've been translated into Polish as well, where he tried to show that each medium of representation expresses and communicates in a slightly different way. In my view, Mcluhan was more of a poet than he was a scientist, which is to say that his ideas were very grand, but were sometimes overstated. And it's been the task of the next generation, which I see myself a member, to try to spell out in more detail and more clearly just what the implications of the media of communication have had on, not just on social organization, but also on the way that we actually think. Mcluhan wasn't greeted with great enthusiasm by academics because there were too many cases in which one could make counter-arguments. So Mcluhan generated as much discussion as he did develop followers. And the place of media of communication continues to be not troublesome, but somewhat confusing and difficult to spell out because the effects and the dimensions are so broad that when one tries to say what the implications of writing or the implications of television or the implications now of the internet, information technology, spelling out those implications are absolutely overwhelming, and people can write almost anything and get away with it because it's too early to tell what the long-term implications of the revolution in communication will be or has been. I myself was not drawn to study information technology. I thought that it was too new, and one couldn't foretell what its implications would be because they're being explored. But writing, on the other hand, the invention of a writing system is much more firmly established. There is much more evidence, and one can make and formulate much more precise theories about how writing may relate to the development of our cognition and to the organization of society. So I've spent most of my time trying to sort out the implications of literacy, and in particular, the title here today, the implications for our understanding of rationality. By rationality, I don't mean anything more than thinking, how one thinks. But it goes slightly beyond that because rationality also implies the notion of reasons for thinking one thing or another. So rationality is the ability to engage in discussion, thinking about our ideas, reflecting on them. So rationality isn't identical to learning, because you can learn habits that aren't particularly based on reasons, whereas discussion, writing, reading, speaking to other people, giving reasons for your answer, or giving reasons for your action, engages our rationality. Now, of course, we all know that Aristotle said that man is a rational animal. For Aristotle, the point was that animals are like persons, but persons are distinctive in that they are not only animals, but they are rational animals. They can think. He, of course, was right. It's astonishing, actually, that the first person who ever, as far as we know, expressed the idea about the peculiar nature of human cognition was pretty well correct. And the last 2,500 years, we have been more or less spelling out or stating more clearly what the implications of Aristotle's original announcement was. So humans are rational animals. Of course, Descartes, we know, also said that it tried to describe human beings as the things which think. Who am I, he says, or what am I? I'm a thing which thinks. That's what Descartes thought was absolutely distinctive about human beings. And of course, we agree. But of course, Descartes thought that to be a thinking thing was to have a body, like we have, but also to have a spiritual, more or less a spiritual domain of ideas where thoughts could take place. And the relationship between what we could think about and the way we acted and the way our bodies acted were two different domains, two quite independent spheres that had contact only in the pineal gland of the brain. Well, Descartes, in my view, was also right. There is a big difference between the things, the way we act, the things that we do, and the kinds of thoughts we can entertain. But of course, in our generation, we're not happy with the notion that thoughts live in a separate domain from our bodies. We now take what we call a naturalistic orientation to the mind. The mind and brain are not some spiritual entity. They are part of our bodies, part of our biological nature. So the relationship between rationality and bodily activity, we now want to try to explain in a completely naturalistic way. And that has been the challenge, more or less since the Enlightenment in the 18th century. People have been trying to say, we are thinkers, but our thinking is part of our biological nature. And we all agree with that, but then the question then remains, how so? How can this be possible? How can we have achieved rationality? Where did it come from? So these are the issues I'll be talking about the nature of rationality, the fact that there is more than one way of being rational, I call narrative versus technical rational discourse. These modes of rationality, I argue, are tied up with speaking and writing. The theories that I mentioned up to this point that postulate man as a rational animal would claim that he's rational in part because he has a language. That's what makes humans different from animals. Humans have a language. And I want to add to that not only do we have a language, we have a written language. and that too has implications. I will argue that the implications come through what I call the awareness of properties of language. Phonemes, words, sentences, paragraphs, genres, a consciousness of language. And in that way I will try to pin writing and rationality together. John Locke too. I mentioned Descartes and Aristotle, but John Locke, the philosopher who more or less has defined what the study of mind has been for about 3 centuries, claimed that rationality was universal. In this he is just repeating Aristotle. But he wrote that God has not been so sparing to men to make them barely 2-legged creatures and left it to Aristotle to make them rational. He has given them a mind that can reason without being instructed in the methods of syllogisms. In other words, Locke thought that we are rational because we have ideas, not necessarily because we have a language. Although a language is useful, he thought, for expressing and sharing our ideas. But he thought that the ideas were the things that made us rational. The theory that I'm more enthusiastic about would say that we have ideas because we have language. Do you see? Usually we say it's common sense, or common at least, to think that we have a mind full of ideas and we use language to tell someone about them. The argument that I will try to advance is that we have ideas because we have a language. The language gives us the options in terms of which we formulate our ideas. So this puts language at the heart of human rationality. And language, peculiarly, is a social phenomenon. To speak a language is not just to think or to imagine or to fantasize. To have a language is to share something in public with others. There is no such thing as a private language, as Wittgenstein is celebrated for having pointed out. Language is something that joins people together. You speak a language because you share it with other people. Well, if we didn't need Aristotle to make us rational, what was Aristotle's contribution? Aristotle's contribution, I will elaborate as I go along, is a new consciousness of language, in particular consciousness of sentences, the logical form of sentences. And I put here to hint at what's to come. His mistake was that he took sentences, the semantics of sentences, as if they were utterances, which is to say, it made no clear distinction between what we now refer to as semantics and pragmatics. Now, those are terms that you may or may not be familiar with. Pragmatics just means use, how you do things, how you practically carry things out, especially how you use language to accomplish very purposes. For example, to make a promise. I can make a promise using language. I can say, I will be in Lublin on May the 7th, perhaps. I've lost complete track of what date it is. But you make a promise and you live up to it. So that's the pragmatics of language. You use it to make promises, to tell people things, to engage in various civic functions and so on. That's the use, the pragmatics of language. The semantics of language have more to do with truth and falsity. Sentences are true or false, as we say. That's the semantics. So, is rationality a universal? I would say yes. But what is rationality? What is it? Is it the ideas that we have? Is it the language that we have? And if it's the language, how does the language relate to what we actually do? Rationality is not just a way of thinking. Rationality is a way of being in the world. Rationality involves responsibility. This is a somewhat new idea to me, and I've been thinking about it for the last only maybe 4 or 5 years. And the idea was put into my head from Robert Brandom, who wrote a book called Making It Explicit, and a number of other books since then, in which he traces the idea of rationality back to Kant by pointing out that language is not just a way of designating things. This is a podium. This is a desk. This is a computer. Language is, because it's a social product, is a way of making us responsible to other people. You see, when I'm speaking to you, and you are listening to me. So when I say something, it's some sort of an agreement between us. In other words, when I say something, I'm giving you my word. You can trust it. Now, I'm careful when I give you my word, because I usually say, I put it in brackets, I say, I think this is the case. I think Aristotle meant this. But when I do say something like concepts are norms, I am not only telling you, communicating you something, I'm taking on a responsibility. I'm giving you assurances that that's the case. And you can hold me accountable too. It's just as the case is exactly the same as for a promise. If I make a promise, I'm giving you my word that I will do something, such and so. And I am under an obligation to you to do it. It's the same when I say something to you. If I say this is a podium, I'm giving you my word it's a podium. I'm taking on responsibility for what I said, and you can hold me responsible. That's why we can scold people if they lie, for example. If someone tells a lie, he violated the norm for speaking. The norm for speaking is that you give your word. So this is the point that Robert Brandom gets from Kant, and it's expressed here. Concepts, ideas, words, are norms. A norm is a rule, an agreement, that determines just what we have made ourselves responsible for, what we have committed ourselves to. And these linguistic norms are usually spelled out in terms of pragmatics that I mentioned earlier. If I make a promise, I have to do such and so. If I make a statement, I'm giving you my word. I put myself under an obligation, and you can hold me responsible for it. I have a quotation from Mcluhan here. It's a bit of a jump from Brandon, but the point that Mcluhan is making here is that these norms changed with the invention of writing. The way we make ourselves responsible to other people in writing and are slightly altered from the way they were in speaking. And Mcluhan was the first, I think, to put his finger on that, although there were a number of other people, as Gregory has pointed out, especially Jack Goody, who is also a colleague, a friend of mine. But Mcluhan put it this way: we have confused reason with literacy. You see, he's turning the tables. And rationalism with a single technology. In other words, Mcluhan is saying that we've lost track of Aristotle's original point, that namely rationality is a property of the mind. And in our society, we think that rationality is completely tied up only with a particular use of language, namely writing. So Mcluhan was skeptical of the modern world, I will say. Mcluhan and Havelock and some of the other great writers in this domain harkened back to an age of oral discourse, where when people spoke, they were actually engaging other people and making promises and forming agreements, which you can do in oral discourse. But in shifting away to writing, you distance the reader, and the author distances him or herself from the text they're writing in a way that violates some of those norms. So Mcluhan thought that writing wasn't a great intellectual advance. It was kind of a bias. It put a spectacle on us that made us see everything in a particular way. And I think he's right about that. The only place I would disagree slightly is that I don't see that the oral tradition was superior to our literate tradition. I would just say they are different. And it's our task to figure out how they are different. So we want to see what has been gained and what has been lost with the development not only of writing, but of using writing in a variety of ways to make up what we call a literate society, a society of writing. Or what I call here literate discourse. This is also a somewhat troubling concept, as some of you know, especially those of you in anthropology, because it tends to prejudice the language and thought of people of other societies, of other cultures, of unwritten cultures. And I think it's all I will say about that at this point is that the attempt is not to make literate discourse the end-all and be-all of rationality. As a matter of fact, I went out of my way at the beginning to say it's not. But rather to say that literacy imparts a kind of bias to cognition. And I think the notion of bias, I don't know if that's a word that's easily translated, but a bias just means it sort of tilts it off a bit, as if you have a particular kind of glasses and you see it just a little bit different. The idea of bias came from Mcluhan's own teacher at the University of Toronto named Harold Ennis, who was an economist who was the first to use the expression, as far as I can recall, of the bias of writing. Okay, where does the action occur? If writing has a bias, where does it occur? It's very well to say that writing is special or peculiar, and another thing to say just in what way. So here's a little bit of technical discourse, and maybe it's very familiar to you, but maybe not familiar to everyone. The pragmatics is thought about in terms of language. I talked about how we use language, the pragmatics of language. Perhaps I can have the other rest of that ball.
Oh, of course.
The balls. Okay, that's great. So pragmatic judgments, I said it's using language, and I gave you the example of making a promise. When you make a promise, you have to live up to it. Well, those are talked about in terms of speech acts. You can make promises, you can make statements, you can make declarations if you have the power. You can declare that Monday is a holiday if you have enough authority. That's something you can do with language. Those are all speech acts. The point I want to make about them is that the primary simplest case of speech act is to make an assertion. This is a podium, or this is a microphone. That's an assertion. It's something I'm just stating it as a fact, and I want you to believe it. You to believe it's a fact, and you can hold me accountable for it. And what they do socially is they require agreement. So if I say this this is the microphone, you may object. No, it's not. If I say this is a microphone, you will agree, presumably. Because assertions work towards agreement or disagreement with the audience. Similarly, commissives, like giving orders, if the fire bell went off and everyone was asked to leave the room, you have to comply. If it's an order, if someone gives an order, you must leave, you must leave. That's another speech act. And so on. You make a promise, you have to live up to it. And so on. Each kind of speech act has rules for social engagement. Semantic judgments, on the other hand, and semantic judgments are very important for rationality. Semantic judgments are based on truth and false judgments. Now, that's a subtle difference. It's a slightly different thing to agree. If I say this is a microphone and you agree with me, it's a slightly different thing to say that's true. But both are the case. Do you see that? If I say this is a microphone, you may say, I agree. Or you may say, that's true or false. Those two things in contemporary theory, I think, are somewhat blurred. And then we'll have more arguments about this over the next 2 or 3 days, because this is an area in which people are working currently. But I want to say that semantic judgments, truth-false judgments, are not ordinary language judgments. I want to say that agreeing or disagreeing is a human universal of rationality. But the judging true and false are peculiar. They're peculiar in that they treat language in a different way. They don't treat an utterance as if it's an assertion. In writing, we treat utterances as if they are statements, which can be true or false. So when I write a paper, I am not only trying to assure agreement, I'm trying to state things that a reader will judge true, and try to avoid statements which a reader might judge as false. And here I say, in this, I probably will come back to this, that semantic judgments are special because they are based on quoted contents. In other words, semantic judgments I want to argue are of the following sort. You might say, Olson said this is a microphone. Olson said, quote, this is a microphone, quote. It's what's in quotation marks that gets the true or false judgment. So the peculiarity of writing, I'll elaborate on this, but the peculiarity of writing, I want to argue, is that it takes expressions, puts them in those quotation marks, and then you make judgments about truth or falsity about it. And I have one example. What I say here, there are true-false judgments. The true-false judgments aren't communicative. They're meta-communicative. Instead of communicating ideas, they're judgments about your communication. So here I have an example. Janet Astington and I in Toronto did many experiments with children. The results sometimes come out as we want them to, and sometimes they don't. But they came out clearly in this case, and I'll describe this to you because I think this makes the point about what people are doing when they hear an utterance. This task is with children. I'm a developmental psychologist, so most of the studies I do are with children. Partly because children are at this beautiful stage of acquiring a language. They don't just know a language, they're acquiring a language. And when they're learning to read and write, they're acquiring literacy, and you can try to see what's happening in their thinking as they go through those processes. But here was a study. The task was actually invented by Olson, an Australian. But we used it repeatedly in Toronto, and here's the kind of effect you get. You tell the child, the man has a hat, and then you show him this or her this picture. And then you say, is this right? The man has a hat. Yes, they say. You say, the man has no hat. Yes. That's wrong. But children have no hesitancy. They say, yes. And then over here, a man has no hat, and you say, the man has a hat, and they say, no. And then you say, the man has no hat. The man has no hat, and they say, no. In other words, they're getting the false items all wrong. This is supposed to be truth-false judgment. In fact, they're not making a true-false judgment. They are agreeing or disagreeing with you. You see, like this. The children are saying, you say the man has a hat, and they say, yes, yes he does. And then you say, the man has no hat, and they say, yes he does. Yes he does. He has a hat. You see? They're saying, I don't agree with you. He does have a hat. So this doesn't mean false. And they're not getting it wrong. It's a different question for them because they are trying to tell you the truth and they want you to tell the truth. And the same with this one. They say the man has no hat, and you say the man has a hat. They say no. No, he doesn't, which is correct. But then you say the man has no hat. They look here and they say the man has no hat. They don't say false. What they're saying here is no, he doesn't. You see the tone of voice? Sotto voce. Sotto voce. Lower your voice. No, he doesn't. I agree with you. He doesn't have a hat. You see? We've replicated this 2 or 3 times, and we've also found 2 or 3 cases where we couldn't replicate it. So I can't say for sure this is an open and shut case. I think it's the truth. I think it's the truth. The children, at the earliest stage, if you say something to them, they quickly tell you they can agree with you about what you're saying or disagree. They can agree or disagree. But it takes another step before they start to look at the sentence here. The man has no hat, and say false. So what's the difference? It's very subtle, but I think it's a true one. The difference is that agreement, which is a pragmatic judgment, it's a social pragmatic judgment, is easier than to step away from the sentence and treat it as if it's something to be judged independently of the speaker, and you just say true or false of it. By the time there's about 7 or 8, they always put X here. But when they're 5 and 6, they put this. And it's not a firm age. It's not firm. It depends a lot. I think partly on the fact that in school they encounter true-false tests. You do in university as well, of course. But true-false tests, you'd think it's the simplest thing in the world. But in fact, it takes a reorientation to language to start to think about statements as if and whether they are true or false. I have another example here of implicatures. This is Papafrago's work, and I haven't done any on this, but I did read these studies. If you say to children in the age range that I'm talking about, some elephants have trunks, they will say yes. Yes, they do. But if you say to adults, some elephants have trunks, They say, well, not exactly. All elephants have trunks. Now, what I want you to notice about this is suddenly the word some and all have become prominent. It's quite correct to agree with someone who says some elephants have trunks. It's not objectionable. But you'd rather say, well, technically, they all have elephants. All elephants have trunks. And this is a development that occurs in the age range I'm talking about. The 5- and 6-year-olds will agree with some elephants have trunks. By the time they're 9 or 10, no, they don't agree with that. So they've changed their interpretation and understanding of some expressions. These things are called implicatures after Grace's theory of communicative competence. Well, I've hinted how writing plays a role. Namely, it has something to do with consciousness of language. And I'll expel this out a bit here. The uses of writing, of course, are enormous. And there are many theories of how writing becomes part of our intellectual and social life. And you'll hear more of this from 2 other speakers this morning. So I will only introduce this topic. But the uses of writing are diverse, and the most commonly expressed ones is their use in making records. The beginning of writing in most societies was traced to the need for keeping records as societies become more complicated. Keeping records of who owns what, of deeds for property and things of that sort. So you could write down on a shard some fact, and that could be consulted later in making a judgment. Some have argued that writing is important because it extends our memory, and this is what we're going to talk much more about, the extended mind theory. George Feiner will talk about that. But it, of course, was famously denied by Plato. You know, Plato said, writing won't extend your memory, it'll induce forgetfulness. Because you'll know you don't need to remember it, it's written down someplace, so you'll not use your mind at all. And memory will deteriorate. Of course, it's true. Most of us can't remember the things we need to buy at the supermarket, so we're forced to keep lists. I carry a little booklet in my pocket that tells my appointments and obligations because I know I won't remember them. So has my memory been enhanced by writing, or has it deteriorated? Well, of course, the argument is that it extends memory in a peculiar way. And just how is to be decided. There's a theory that writing externalizes the memory. This is Merlin Donald used that notion that he sort of said we kind of grow an extra biological unit for our brains that we use for our memories. You know, as if we stuck a little block on the side of our head and it was doing some calculating for us. Of course, the use of writing is also for communication at a distance. You can send messages across greater distance through time. You can keep secrets. You can write secrets. You can keep a private diary, and those sorts of things. So there are many ways of looking at the use of writing. And the question before us is not just about writing, but about all the media. How do they change these functions? How do they alter our cognitions? My theory then, as I've sort of implied by the last slide or two, is that writing is important perhaps among other things. But writing is important in that it gives us new things to think about. Namely, units of sound, words, and sentences. Now, you'd think those things are already in place if you're a speaker of a language. You can't speak a language if you don't know the phonology. Knowing a language is knowing the phonology, you'd say. And that's true. And similarly, the words. How can you talk if you don't know what the words are and what the words mean? And how can you talk if you don't have syntactic structures that relate subjects and predicates, and so on? So in some sense, you know all of those things to be a speaker of a language. But my point is that those things are, as Brandon would say, implicit in practice. You use syntactic structures and you use words, but you don't think about the words. You just use them. You don't realize that transitive verbs require an object. Only grammarians think of things like that. You just say, if you say the boy kicked, you add kick what? Kick the ball. You just use those grammatical structures. They're sort of automatic or unconscious. That's not quite right either, because children are quite conscious of them. If they hear you change the pronunciation of a word, they change the pronunciation of a word. So they have a very good ear for phonemic variation, for lexical choice, and syntactic structure. But those things aren't themselves objects of thought. They don't become things to think about. They're things that are more or less used somewhat automatically. And what writing does is it turns those things into thinkables, like phenomenology. This is the best known case, and the others are more problematic. But in the case of phonology, I think you know this, the phenomenon of phonological awareness. If you say to someone who's not a reader, say the word fish, they say fish, and then you say, now say fish, but don't say the what would you have? And you're supposed to say fish. It's very easy for anybody who's a reader or a writer. And it was well known for 50 years that children couldn't do that. You say to children, say fish, they say fish, and you say, now say fish, but don't say the they say fish. They can't find that in the word. And it's even worse for middle or final phonemes. They're very difficult to find. And about the 1980s, it was found that this isn't because they're children, which had been the assumption. It's because they are not readers. So, some of you know this word too, but Allegria, Content, and Bertelsen, and de Gelder, a number of people went to Portugal, actually, to a remote fishing village where half of the people had learned to read and the other half had never been to school at all. And in an inspired task, they gave these kinds of tasks to these fishermen who are now in the age range of 40, between 40 and around age 40, so they're adults. The interesting thing was the people who had been to school even for 1 year could say ish if you asked to not say the for fish. But the people who had never been to school, had never been acquainted with learning to read, still couldn't do it. Which is to say, it's not because you're getting older, it's because you've learned to think about words in a different way. You hear the words as composed of units of sound, whereas most fluent speakers hear them as acoustic patterns. Now this is complicated because on one hand you can say a speaker knows the phonology or they wouldn't be a speaker of that language. On the other, they don't know about the phonology in the sense that they can't bring it into awareness and think about it. So the phonology case is fairly clear. Words and sentences are the ones that have more association with rationality, and those are the ones that I'm going to talk more about. Because words, too, everybody knows the words of the language, but are the words subject to reflection? Can they think about words? Can they think about sentences? And I've just mentioned here that Vygotsky has had something to say about this as well, because Vygotsky at least gave the model for this. He said that language is transparent, like a window. You see through the language to the world being described. Whereas writing makes you see the window, makes you see the language. And this is necessarily so, because in order to write, you have to hear, again, these constituents. You know, how do you spell the word butterfly? Well, you have to hear butterfly. You have to hear constituents. And the constituents tend to be the sounds represented by letters of the alphabet. And as a matter of fact, one could argue, and Roy Harris, among others, have argued, that in fact, when you hear the sounds or analyze the sounds of the words in terms of the letters of the alphabet, you're actually hearing sounds that aren't really there. They're categories for thinking about those sounds. The phonemes you find are imposed or invented as much as they are discovered. So invention and discovery is the tricky point there. And the same for words. Are words there? We'll talk about that. Okay, I've talked about consciousness of phonemes, and I mentioned algorithm. But consciousness of words, we did many studies on this topic in the early 80s with children, in which we would give ambiguous messages, for example, and then ask the children, did I say the blue box? And we may have said something like, put the marble in the box, and put it in the red box, and then we said, well, actually it's supposed to be in the blue box. And we would say, did we say the blue box? And they would say that we had. If that's what we meant to say, they would say that's what we had said. They didn't distinguish what we'd actually said from what we had meant to say. And in their own case, it was even worse. If they meant to say the blue box but had said only the box, they would insist that they had said the blue box. In other words, they had a fuzzy boundary, at least, between the words they had used and the intentions that they were trying to express, the belief they held. But there is also evidence from many other places. Eric Havelock, one of our joint heroes, pointed out that it was only about, I think something like 300 BC, that the Greeks, a little earlier, 500 BC, that the Greeks started to play with words to make, for example, lists of synonyms. The first book of synonyms, I've written down who the author was, and I can't think of it. It was considered quite an achievement that you could actually find words that meant the same thing. Modern thesaurus, if you ever use a thesaurus in your writing, which you probably do, I do occasionally, you find that there are many words with related meanings. Well, the first attempt to look through your own vocabulary and see if words are synonymous was pioneered by the Greeks in the classical period. So that meant they were thinking about words, how words are related to other words. Jung, Carl Jung, the famous student of Freud, invented the word association test. And Jung hoped that by saying a word and you prompting a word back, he would be able to tell something about your cognitions. The test is still used by some people. His results, I would say, as a skeptic, are rather miserable. They don't tell you very much about a person when they associate to a word. Although, to some extent, they're like an ink blot test or anything else. A little bit. But the interesting thing, I read that book again a year or two ago. And the interesting thing about the data was that he had subjects who were educated, ordinary middle-class people, but he also was bold enough to use a broad range of subjects. Educated, uneducated, people who were considered sort of out of it. And the interesting thing was, it was only the more or less educated people who could do a word association test. It's rather like our phoneme test. The people who could read can take this off the fish to make ish. But it was the people who had some schooling who, if you said, when I say the word bungalow, what do you think? Who would say house, for example? So word associations aren't a universal competence. It's a kind of reflective competence. It's thinking about words. And there's some nice work, recent work by Himmelman, who's an anthropologist who's done studies in Indonesia. And he asked local informants to break utterances into constituents to see if they had the notion of a word. Could they divide utterances into words? The cat is on the mat, as we take for granted. And the interesting thing was they could break sentences into constituents. But if you asked them to do it again the next day, they would have different constituents. And if you asked another person to do it, they may have yet other constituents. In other words, the natural constituents for analyzing speech into its parts are not necessarily those that we take for granted, namely words, noun phrases, verb phrases, and so on. It can be analyzed into all sorts of units. And then the one that I focused on a little more attention in the last few years is this consciousness of sentential connectives, if not, and, or, all, and some. Logical connectives, we would say. What is children's understanding of those connectives? I mean, they're critical to grammar, especially for connecting propositions with each other. If it's raining, then take your umbrella, and so on. The man has no hat, not, and conjunctions. What happens to those meanings of those words under the impact of literacy? And my argument is that they become quite precise. Residual meanings are excluded, and they come to have meanings that are quite similar to logical operators. So that if, not, an and, an or become logical connectives, which is to say they have indubitable implicational relations. Whereas in ordinary language, they're used rather broadly. So this is the point I've been making. That the norms of language are implicit in practice. And that's what we call being linguistically competent. But they can be represented, and have been, or are represented explicitly in writing. Now, explicitly doesn't mean without change. Explicitly means categories for, namely phonemic segments, semantic relations amongst words, and sentential logical relations amongst propositions. And then literacy requires a new way of thinking about language because of more careful attention to the meanings of such connectives. Here's another example, going back to children. Now here's about words. This is a task by Joseph Herner and Martin Doherty. Beautiful task. They take children in the same age we've been talking about. They tell children, they have other animals on the screen, and they might say, point to the rabbit, and they point to this one. Point to the fox, they point to some other animal. Point to the bunny, they point back to this rabbit. So they know that bunny and rabbit both refer to that animal. And then they play a game with the child. They say, okay, if I say bunny, you must say rabbit. when that picture comes up. And if I say rabbit, you must say bunny. And amazingly, they show the rabbit, and the experimenter says rabbit, and the child says rabbit. In other words, you would have thought they're synonyms. Why not just go to the synonym? It's not that easy. And the reason I would say, again, is they're not thinking about the words rabbit and bunny. They're thinking about this animal. And when they're thinking about the animal, the word immediately comes to mind. But they can't think about the words and an alternative word. It's also known that children have difficulty with paraphrasing. I remember trying to help my daughter write an essay, and I would say to her, well, put it in she would copy things out of the encyclopedia, as everyone's child has done, or out of the textbook, and I would say, no, use your own words. One child, this wasn't my own, but one child said, I don't know any other words. They didn't realize the possibility of paraphrase. You could express the same idea in different words. And actually, that's kind of practiced talent, as you all, as academics, know, that to find another more direct way of expressing an idea other than the words that you've been reading them in is quite a challenging activity. But this is an evidence then that children aren't thinking about words. They're thinking about objects. See, the language, this is Vygotsky's point again, they're looking through the language to the object. Now, of course, they can think about the words to some extent. It would be extreme to say they have no knowledge of the words, because they can use them, they can judge they're appropriate, they can know they can know some properties of them. Piaget showed, though, that if you ask children about a long word and a short word, if you said, is butterfly a long word, they'd say, no, butterfly is very short. Because they don't think about the word, they think about the thing. So Piaget had detected that earlier on. He made a different story about it than the story I'm making here. And then one of our own studies, this was actually done with my grandchild. She came into the room one day when I was pondering these things about writing. And I just happened to say to her, there was pencil and paper lying there, and I said to her, Megan, can you write cat? Can you write cat? She said, I don't know how to write. She was 4, I think. 4. I said, well, just pretend you're writing. Do your best. Oh, okay, that sounds great. So she took a pen and she made that big long squiggle. And then I realized the ambiguity there, can you write cat? So I said, well, can you write 2 cats? And she made that long squiggle, and then she put the little one above it. Well, that could be 2 cats. You don't really know. But then I said, well, can you write 3 cats? And she made 3 squiggles. But if you think about 3 cats, it's only 2 words in 3 cats. So she's not writing words. And I realized she wasn't writing words. So then I knew she was caught. So I said to her, 3 cats again. Then I said to her, can you write no cats? And her eyes got the biggest saucers. She realized she was in a hopeless dilemma. So she took her pencil and held it about this far above the paper and made it a motion in the air. And then she said, there were no cats, so I didn't write anything. But again, I use this to make the point that when you say, can you write 3 cats, you're making a distinction between the world that you're depicting and the language you're using to depict it. And she wasn't really tuned into the language. And she didn't think that writing was about words. She thought writing was about the cats. And interestingly, I've done a fair amount of work in the world on paper too, but since on the invention of writing systems. And the early inventions of writing systems were just that way. They wrote just the way Megan did. If there were 3 objects, they had 3 signs. If there were 5 objects, they'd have 5 signs. And it was only later that they developed the idea that the writing should represent the verbal expression of the idea. So then they started to use signs that meant one thing to represent the sound pattern of a different word. Like the word bee, for example, bumblebee, which might be represented one day, and then you want to write before. Well, you might take the sign for the bee and use it as the first sign in the word for before. You see, use it now phonologically, which is called the acrophonic principle. That came later. So early writing systems were on Megan's wavelength. Later writing systems capture linguistic form. And that's a major achievement. You have to discover words. But the same is true for these logical connectives. This is a study from Margaret Donaldson. Are all the cars in the garage? You say to this. And children will say no, because one of them's empty. You see, the all, they think, should apply both to the cars and the garages. Are all the cars in the garage? No, because one is empty. And then for this one, do all the garages have cars in them? We would say yes, but they say no, because there's one over there. You see, all doesn't strictly apply to the noun it qualifies. It applies to all the nouns in the expression, which is to say, the boundaries for interpreting logical connectives have to be sorted out, or taught, I would say. Practiced and taught. That's what schooling is about. Here was another example that I've used for years from Luria, and you all know this. In the far north, where there is snow, all the bears are white. Notice the expression, all the bears are white. Novaya Zemlya is in the far north, and there is always snow there. What color are the bears there? Literate subjects, of course, answer white, because they treat it strictly, rationally, we would say. And by rationally here, I mean only they're paying particular attention to the wording. But non-literate subjects, of course, gave all these charming answers, which we find quite amusing. They would say such things as, well, I don't know, there are different sorts of bears. Some subjects would say, I've never been to Novaya Zemlya, you'll have to ask Ivan, which is the cutest answer. Well, they're charming answers, and they're perfectly rational answers. They're just not answers that we now take as typical of educated discourse, which is to say strict interpretation for expressions like if, then, all, or some. This goes back to the thing, do some elephants have trunks? And children will say yes, and older subjects will say, not really, all elephants have trunks. They start to notice that they put additional weight onto particular interpretations of these. This is another example of that sort of thing, which I'll skip. Here's a tricky version. I'll ask you, and I think you will probably fail this item. I have 2 coins in my pocket. Together they add up to 30 cents. Now I'm thinking about Canadian and American coins. But one of them is not a nickel. What are they? Seems impossible. Until you notice that it said one of them. That leaves open the possibility that the other one is a nickel. So they're just as you thought. They're a nickel and a quarter. That makes 30 cents. But you see, you're tricked by this expression. One of them is not a nickel. It should have said neither of them is a nickel, if you didn't want one to be a nickel. But if you say one of them is not a nickel, it leaves open the interpretation that the other one is a nickel, and the first one is a quarter. You see this? It's a trick question, but it does play on sensitivity to exact wording. I don't know how many, I'm not going to take a show of hands, but that's the question. And many of you aren't, for many of you, English isn't even first language, so it must be miserably opaque. But most people don't get that item until they're prompted or told to pay close attention. So I've taken this, we have this cowboy and Indian story well known around the world about the Lone Ranger and his Indian aide called Tonto. And Tonto would say, white man speaks with forked tongue, which is to say, you said one thing but you really implied another. You know, and Tonto supposedly didn't care for that kind of discourse, and I'm sympathetic, of course. So we're getting close to the end here. Sentential reasoning. How do we get sentential reasoning? And sentential reasoning is just the kind of reasoning that I've been saying depends on the particular wording of the sentences, the semantic interpretation defined by precise usage. Well, this is Roy Harris's idea, and I think it's I'm very sympathetic. With the arrival of the sentence, a new form is created for the discussion of human thinking. The sentence is the basis of Aristotelian syllogism. That's what Aristotle did. He took sentences. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Sentences are not utterances. See the difference? An utterance is something you say communicatively in expressing a view that you share with others. Sentences are abstracted from utterances. I earlier suggested they're the things that are more or less in quotation marks. They're sort of separated out, where they become objects in their own right. And then you can think about those sentences, and that's when you start to judge truth and falsity. Harris goes on, this new form, however, is also an intellectual cage or enclosure imposing its own limitations. It cannot accommodate non-sentential modes of thought. That's a little bit like the Mcluhan idea, that namely, we now think that the precise interpretation of all and some and so on are what define rationality. And so we think that anybody who interprets them in a different way is irrational. Of course, they're not irrational. They're just not highly literate, or they're not thinking in their literate thinking path. And then my way I would express that same idea is that awareness of language allows one to reason logically, that is according to the words, that is according to the semantics of an expression. A linguist, Liesenberg, has made much the same point about literal meanings, which are these sentence meanings. Literal meanings are the end product of a long social and historical process. Literal meanings depend on the stabilization and codification of linguistic norms. These are achieved with the aid of literacy, education, and standardization of language and lexicography, and are late to be acquired, usually as the result of schooling. So here's my conclusion. Danny Kahneman has recently become famous for his studies of rationality. I don't know if you know this literature, it's very interesting. It's drawn a great deal of research, where they make tasks that are essentially like the ones I said. All the bears, if you know Lila Zemla, are white. So what color are the bears there? And people will often fall into these linguistic traps. Or you say, I have 2 coins in my pocket, one of them is not a nickel. People often fall into the trap of thinking that neither of them is a nickel. And so on. They're tasks. I'm not going to go into them. But they play on the precise meaning of particular terms. And in most contexts, people aren't attentive to that. They're more interested in following the story, knowing what you're talking about. So they fall into error. And I criticize those studies by saying that they are logical reasoning tasks that disguise the logical form in narrative structures. And in narrative structures, you're looking more or less for the holistic meaning rather than for the particular meaning of individual terms. Logical reasoning tasks require special orientation to sentences, in particular translating ordinary language terms into the logical connectives and or not, and quantifiers all in sum. I made an inventory of the meanings of the verb is, and some of you have seen the paper I wrote about that. They are abundant. Is has an enormous range of meanings, which is to say an enormous range of uses. And to take one of them as being the existential is just one possibility. And a listener in the language might not know that that's the particular meaning that you had in mind. This specialized use of language is historically late. It's a special purpose. It's taught in the school as part of a literate tradition based largely on a new consciousness of aspects of language, namely its linguistic form. Thank you. That's it.